This is Chapter 6 on learning. This is Part 5, Operant Conditioning Applications, and this is Professor Munk. All right, so just a little bit of review from what we talked about last time, and this is differentiating negative reinforcement and punishment. So here's some terms that we'll be using again here in an exercise, right? So avoidance learning is behavior that removes the possibility of a stimulus occurring. So we engage in behavior so that we can avoid a stimulus or an event from occurring. We're engaging in avoidance learning. So one question I like to ask students is, do you study hard for an exam because you're motivated by positive reinforcement and a good grade, or are you motivated by avoidance learning, and that is the avoiding of a bad grade? So I'll just leave that there and let you think about it. So hopefully it's the former, but I can say as a student, and still there's some things that I certainly work hard at, and I'm thinking more about not failing and avoiding what could happen if I don't try my hardest. So probably a little bit of both, right? And let's talk about escape learning. So if you're already in a situation that you'd like to escape or terminate, then you would engage in more of a particular behavior, the behavior that it's going to take to end it. So one easy way of thinking, I think about this is if you have some sort of limitation put on you, and you'll see an example of this in just a second, or a situation that it's uncomfortable, then let's imagine you're in a social situation and you're really uncomfortable, and there are people there that you don't want to talk to and such. Maybe that's never happened to you, but it certainly has to me, and I suspect it has to some of your friends too. Then it could be that it might increase the likelihood of you not feeling well. And I'm not talking about just reporting that you're not feeling well. I'm talking about actually starting to develop symptoms of stomach problems and such. So sometimes students do this in school. They will, when they're in a difficult subject and it's not going well and they're struggling with it. Sometimes students that I've worked with would misbehave in order to be removed from the classroom. And what's really happening is that they were trying to get out of a situation that was really uncomfortable. Positive punishment is different. It's a process in which behavior decreases because it adds or increases a particular stimulus. So in other words, behavior occurs and then something is added which functions as a punisher. And I mentioned in the last set of slides, we tend to think about reinforcement and punishment as we like it or we don't like it, pleasant or unpleasant, kind of going way back to the law of effect. But actually, you have to be careful about that. The consequences for behavior really need to be defined by their impact on behavior and not whether or not it seems like something that would be punishing for us or reinforcing for us. So this is adding something. Negative punishment occurs when a behavior decreases because it removes or diminishes a particular stimulus. Right? So let's go to the example because I think that it will make it clear how these work. All right, so this is the case of the new driver, and Avocado just got their driver's license. Avocado received a warning for speeding the first week of driving. I hope that never happened to you. And Avocado's parent guardian wants Avocado to drive safely. All right, so Avocado's parent happens to know a little bit about behavioral psychology, actually a lot about behavioral psychology, and so wants to use learning theory, operant theory, to try to influence Avocado's safe driving, right? So we're going to talk about what we might do in each of these categories. So keep in mind, so let's talk about reinforcement. So in reinforcement, we want to increase behavior, and that's important. So right now we're focusing on increasing behavior, which is the positive behavior, which is driving within the speed limit. Okay, so we want more of that. We're going to focus on that. So positive reinforcement. So some things that you might do for positive reinforcement, and maybe some of you have been in this situation before. And I can say as a parent, I've kind of had to make these sorts of decisions, maybe about driving and certainly about some other things. But positive reinforcement, what we would do is if Avocado was driving within the speed limit for however long we asked them to do it, then there'd be positive reinforcement. So it would be adding something to it, right? So I can imagine that it could be, let's say, if you stay within the speed limit, avocado, and you do that for an entire week, that we give you gas money, for example. Maybe you get your curfew extended for 15 minutes. Let's go wild, right? So we're increasing driving within the speed limit, and avocado's doing it. So we've offered up what we hope are going to be positive reinforcers right here by adding something that wasn't before. Right? Now, this one's tricky, negative reinforcement. So keep in mind that what we want is to increase driving within the speed limit, all right? So that means to use negative reinforcement, avocado has to drive. Because you might say, well, it's easy to avoid not driving within the speed limit because I just won't drive. You just tell avocado not to drive. Yeah, but that's not an example of negative reinforcement. And it's actually doesn't teach anything new. What we want to do is in reinforcement is encourage behavior, right? We want to see the behavior occur more frequently, the behavior that we're looking for. So negative reinforcement. So here, I wonder what you're thinking about right now. Well, if you're thinking about a condition that might be imposed on avocado that would increase the likelihood that avocado would drive within the speed limit, then you're on the right track. Okay. So what could that be? So I know my insurance agent tried to sell me this special reduced insurance policy, but they were going to have to be able to track the speed on my car. They put a little device in there, and they're able to keep track of how fast you're going all the time. So I wasn't crazy about that, and my sons were definitely not interested in that. So we didn't use that. But that would actually be a case of something where you would have a situation where you would be driving safely to try to avoid something that happened if, in fact, the record showed that you had been driving poorly or over the speed limit, not poorly. So negative reinforcement would be something like this. Let's imagine that you can't take a friend in your car until you've driven within the speed limit for 2 consecutive weeks, right? So let's see how that's working. There's a condition that avocado wants to terminate, and that is no friends in the car. And so to do that, avocado can't just stay home and not drive. Avocado has to drive, and avocado has to drive within the speed limit for 2 weeks. And even another example, and one which I think will make you all gasp, is that a parent could ride with avocado. I know that took you back, didn't it? So I think we can all agree that that is a condition that avocado would drive within the speed limit to terminate that, probably as quickly as possible. So now let's switch. So reinforcement increases behavior. Now let's talk about punishment. Decreases behavior. We have 2 kinds: positive punishment, negative punishment. Right? In positive punishment, we're adding something, we're adding a stimulus or condition that wasn't there before, intended to punish. So that might be, for example, if avocado gets a speed warning, then avocado has extra chores at home, right? So we have to add something to it. Add something to it. This one's not as easy to work with in this example because I think most of you are thinking about this one. That is taking things away. Right? So that makes more sense because maybe you've encountered this yourself, that usually if we don't follow the rules, we have privileges taken away, right? So a negative punishment, if avocado was driving and was not within the speed limit, then all kinds of things could be taken away, right? Driving privileges, could be curfew earlier and such, okay? But what I want to make sure that you understand, and what you'll definitely have to be able to differentiate on the exam, is that reinforcement increases behavior. These both will cause avocado, hopefully, to drive safely. Punishment reduces a behavior that we don't want to see, but it doesn't necessarily. So, for example, let me say that if avocado wanted to avoid this negative punishment, avocado could simply not drive, right? Well, that's not solving anything, because when you were a young driver, beginning driver, if you had any kind of a problem, you know that what you really need to do is to get right back into the seat and start driving again, right? You want to practice the behavior and get better at it. So, all right. So there's the case of the new driver. So shaping, it's an important procedure, and because what we can assume is that every behavior, we don't, in our repertoires, we don't have it like the finished version of behaviors that we need in order to be reinforced. So it's a procedure in which successive approximations of response are reinforced. Okay, it's done. You've learned a lot of things that way, and probably the things that come you don't remember, but that's how you probably learn to use language as an adult. You would babble and you would make sounds. They weren't words, and they certainly weren't sentences, and they may not have made sense. Boy, did people pay attention to it, and they encouraged it, and they responded back to you, so you kept trying, right? Until eventually, by a certain age, you were starting to use words and then sentences and such, and then that shaping procedure just continued on up through up through kindergarten, where you were still working on longer and longer phrases and different vocabulary and such. You probably learned to ride a bike this way. A few of us get on a bike and start right out. Probably, in fact, you had someone hanging on to you. Probably were a little tipsy at the beginning. And I would say handwriting is another example that most of us shaping. If you go back and dig out some of those worksheets that you did when you were 4 or 5, you'll see that the letters are huge, and that they were not in a straight line always. And you know what? You didn't spell all the words correctly, but no one said anything about it, right? Hopefully, because that's what's called developmental spelling, right? So it's a shaping process, right? If we had to wait for a final version of a behavior to occur before it could be reinforced, there'd be a lot less reinforcement, right? And so fortunately, there's a lot of shaping that can go on, and in teaching, especially in applied behavior analysis, we spend a lot of time um, teaching, and this is especially popular, and maybe some of you have actually worked as therapists for children with autism on autism spectrum disorder. We use ABA and we do a lot of shaping. All right, schedules of reinforcement. It's the rules that determine when reinforcement's available, predictable, or irregular. Right, so remember, reinforcement's a stimulus, could be an event that occurs following a behavior and increases the probability of the behavior happening in the future. So it could be that every time the response is made, it's reinforced. Okay? Or it's more likely in real life that it doesn't get reinforced every single time, but after a certain number of responses or after a certain amount of time, reinforcement is available. So, of course, this was studied with laboratory animals initially, but also then there's a lot of applied research with human beings also talking about this. And there's some examples we'll talk about in the next set of slides. And here is a big table that you should be familiar with. I'm just going to point out here that it differentiates classical and operant conditioning. It talks about the different ways in which extinction occurs. It's unpairing, withdrawal of reinforcement. It talks about how generalization and discrimination differ between the two. Right? So this is review. We've talked about this before, and I talked about it in other slides, but I think I point this out because this is a really helpful table for you for looking to get ready for taking the exam, and also especially for a essay question that you might get on the exam, where I actually ask you to kind of differentiate what extinction and generalization discrimination might be. So, all right.